The intake officer's name was something with 4 syllables and 2 glottal stops. I stopped trying to pronounce it after the third attempt and just called him officer, which seemed to satisfy him. He had pale carapace plating along the jaw and upper thorax, the kind that catches fluorescent light and turns it a sick yellow-white. And he moved the way all Vethian compliance staff moved, slow, deliberate, radiating the deep institutional confidence of a man who has never once seen his paperwork refused. He laid the intake packet on the counter between us, 43 pages. He tapped the cover sheet with one claw and said, in serviceable galactic common, that the administrative review process for Customs Anomaly Class 7 was 180 standard days. He said it the way you say something that ends the conversation. I picked up the packet. I said, all right. That was the first morning. The holding station at Auras 9 sits in the transit corridor between the Vethian Compact's outer administrative ring and the open lanes. It is not a prison. That distinction mattered to them. There were no bars, no cells, only processing suites and waiting areas, and a cafeteria that served something gray and warm at 6-hour intervals. The detainees I passed in the intake hall were from 6 different species. Most of them had the look you get after a few weeks of procedural exhaustion. Eyes down, shoulders forward, the particular slump of a being who has started to believe the paperwork is real. The Vethians built the process to do that. I understood it within the first hour. The 180-day figure was not a processing timeline. It was a wearing down schedule. 43 pages of forms referencing 62 supporting documents, each supporting document requiring 3 forms to access, the whole structure circular enough that you could spend 6 months chasing your own tail and never locate the load-bearing clause. The one that, if you found it, collapsed the entire hold. I know this because I read the posted regulations. They were on the wall of the intake hall, framed. 6 panels of administrative code in Vethian script with galactic common translation, the kind of thing that gets mounted because regulations require it to be mounted and no one ever actually reads it. I stood in front of those panels for about 2 hours after Officer 4 syllables finished his speech. I had a notepad. I took notes. A Vethian junior compliance clerk watched me from across the hall for the first 20 minutes, decided I was confused or eccentric, and went back to his terminal. I was neither. The compact transit accords were negotiated before the Vethians joined the compliance framework. The version mounted on that wall was the administrative code as amended by those accords, and Section 11, Clause 4 of the Accords established a direct filing exemption for any customs anomaly proceeding where the detaining authority had failed to document independent corroboration within 48 hours of flag initiation. I checked the timestamp on my intake paperwork. They had flagged me at hour 1. It was now hour 6. The documentation window closed in 42 hours. I asked the junior clerk at the terminal if I could access the station's filing system. He blinked at me, 4 eyelids, cycling top to bottom, which is what Vethians do when they are mildly confused, and said the filing system was for compliance staff. I asked if detainees had the right to submit counter-documentation under the Compact Transit Accords. He looked at his screen. He looked at me. He looked at his screen again. He said he would have to check with his supervisor. I told him I would wait. His supervisor arrived 11 minutes later. She was older, higher-grade carapace, and she had the supervisory version of the institutional confidence, a little sharper, a little more brittle. She explained carefully that the filing system interface was administrative infrastructure and not a detainee resource. I asked her where in the Compact Transit Accords that limitation was codified. She said that was not how the process worked. I said with respect that I had just read the process. There was a pause. She told me the counter-documentation provision was a legacy clause from the original treaty negotiations. She said it had never been successfully invoked because the filing requirements were extremely technical. I asked her if she was telling me the clause did not exist or telling me it was difficult. She said those were not the only two options. I told her I thought they probably were. She gave me access to the filing terminal. I filed the counter notice at 11:47 station time. 3 clauses, properly cited, with the timestamp discrepancy attached as Exhibit 1. The system accepted it. I got a confirmation reference number. I wrote the number on my notepad, tore out the page, folded it, and put it in my jacket pocket. Then I went to the cafeteria and ate the gray warm thing, which tasted like mineral paste with a faint suggestion of something that had once been protein. I had 2 portions. I read the second half of the administrative code while I ate, not because I needed it, but because it was there. The senior adjudicator arrived at 1400. He was taller than the others, darker carapace with a faint iridescent sheen at the thorax joints, and he carried himself with the weight of someone who had personally closed several hundred detainee proceedings and had never lost one. He had my counter notice in his hand, a printed copy, I noticed, which meant someone had been in enough of a hurry to print it rather than read it on a screen. He sat across from me in the processing suite and explained that the counter notice mechanism had specific procedural prerequisites and that based on his review, those prerequisites had not been met. He said it the way Officer 4 Syllables had said 180 days, as a thing that ended conversations. I asked him which prerequisite he believed was unmet. He said the provision required the detaining authority to have failed to document independent corroboration within 48 hours. He said the documentation had, in fact, been submitted. I asked him when it had been submitted. He checked his terminal. He checked it again. He told me documentation had been submitted at 13:22. I said that was an hour and 35 minutes after I filed the counter notice. There was a silence. It was a different quality of silence from the earlier ones. The supervisor was standing near the door. The junior clerk was not in the room, but I could see him through the processing suite window, standing very still at his terminal. The adjudicator said that post-filing documentation might still satisfy the procedural requirement. He said he would need to consult with the compliance director. I told him I'd be in the cafeteria. I had 2 more portions of the gray thing. The compliance director came to find me there rather than summoning me to a processing suite, which told me something. She was the highest grade carapace I had seen, almost white under the fluorescence, with the careful, deliberate movement of someone who was not used to walking toward problems. She was carrying a data tablet. My counter notice was on it. The exhibit was on it. The confirmation reference number was on it. She sat down across from me and read the filing in silence for about 3 minutes. I finished eating. She set the tablet down. She said the compliance directorate would need to review the applicability of the reference clauses. She said the review period was 48 hours. I told her the hold expired in 39. Another silence. She was very controlled. I could see her running through the same structure I'd run through that morning, looking for the load-bearing clause, looking for the procedural foothold that would let her rebuild the box. She was competent. Given a day and a half, she probably could have found something. But she did not have a day and a half, and she knew it, and I watched her arrive at that understanding in real time. It took about 40 seconds. I folded my napkin. I put it on the tray. I said, if the directorate needed more than 39 hours to complete its review, I would be happy to wait in the transit lounge rather than a processing suite, per Clause 7 of the same accord, given that the hold was now procedurally contested. I said I had a bag packed. She looked at me for a long moment. The cafeteria was quiet. The other detainees had found things to look at that were not us. She said she would process the release. I stood up. I carried my tray to the return slot. I picked up my bag from the processing suite locker where they had put it that morning, where I had put it neatly, because I had not unpacked it. I walked down the intake hall past the 6 framed panels of administrative code, past Officer 4 Syllables, who was watching me from behind the counter with the expression of a being who had just watched something happen that he did not have a category for. I nodded to him on the way out. The transit corridor beyond the processing door was wide and full of light from the station's main viewport. The pale arch of the transit lane spread out below like a road that had been there forever. I had a connection to catch. I had 40 minutes. I had always had 40 minutes, I just need